Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Susan Slaugenhaupt, and I'm joining this event today in my role as the Scientific Director of the Mass General Research Institute. On behalf of the Mass General Research Institute, the Department of Psychiatry, and the MGH Psychiatry Leadership Council, I'm delighted to welcome you, our donors and our friends, to a presentation and discussion on the topic When It Comes to Your Health, Sex Matters, featuring Dr. Jill Goldstein, founder and executive director of the Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine at Mass General, fondly known as the MGH icon. Before I introduce Dr. Goldstein, I'd like to take a moment to run through a few Zoom housekeeping details, even though I'm sure you're all experts by this time. In the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you have controls for both the video, which is the little camera, and the audio, the little microphone. We will ask each of you to mute your microphone during Dr. Goldstein's formal remarks. We would like this meeting to be very interactive, and so we invite each of you to join us on camera. However, should you prefer to remain off camera, simply click the stop video in the bottom left of your screen. Once we begin the discussion segment, however, we are eager to hear what is most important to you, so we hope to see and hear from all of you. For best viewing during Dr. Goldstein's remarks, you may want to go to the top right of your screen and select speaker mode. Dr. Goldstein will share a few slides. When these appear on the screen, you can adjust the viewing by moving the vertical line on your screen to the left or to the right, which will change the size of the slide. I will be moderating the question and answer discussion. You can either ask questions live by raising your hand and then unmuting your microphone. To raise your hand, you can click on the reactions button, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and then click raise hand to ask a question or make a comment. Or you're welcome to enter your questions into the chat by typing them in during Dr. Goldstein's talk. Simply click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type away, and I'll be watching for all of your questions to come in. So with the housekeeping things out of the way, it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jill Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is professor of psychiatry and medicine at Harvard Medical School. She is the founder and executive director of the Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, or ICON. And she is the Helen T. Morschner Endowed MGH Research Institute Chair in Women's Health. Endowed MGH Research Institute chairs are unique in that they are not tied to a specific department or a field, as their work typically spans multiple disciplines and plays a key role in preventing disease and improving the lives of patients and families everywhere. These accomplished senior researchers, like Dr. Goldstein, provide essential training and mentorship for the next generation of scientists and offer invaluable scientific leadership across our hospital. I understand how transformative these chairs can be, as I have the distinct pleasure of being the Elizabeth G. Riley and Daniel E. Smith Jr. Endowed MGH Research Institute Chair. Dr. Goldstein fits the mold of scientific leader and mentor perfectly. A clinical neuroscientist by training, she is an expert in sex differences in health and diseases associated with the central nervous system, in particular, major depression, its co-occurrence with cardiovascular disease, and the risk for Alzheimer's disease. A thought leader, a science innovator, and dedicated mentor, Dr. Goldstein has spent her career at Harvard training the next generation of clinicians and scientists in women's health and sex differences in medicine. We are fortunate and deeply grateful that in 2016, Dr. Maurizio Fava, who is the chief of our Department of Psychiatry here at the hospital, was able to recruit Dr. Goldstein to return to MGH, where she originally trained in clinical neuroscience, to launch ICON. Along with colleagues in the departments of psychiatry, OBGYN, neurology, and cardiology at Mass General, the mission of the Innovation Center is to enhance our understanding of sex differences in medicine and translate those findings into novel therapies that will be more effective for both men and women. As the scientific director of the Mass General Research Institute, I am particularly pleased to host Dr. Goldstein today. Dr. Goldstein's groundbreaking research in the Innovation Center on Sex Differences drives highly advanced clinical care across all disease areas. In particular, some of the biggest problems healthcare faces today, with a focus on depression, Alzheimer's disease, and heart disease. Her cross-cutting work truly exemplifies the Mass General Research Institute's mission. And so with that, thank you, Dr. Goldstein, for joining us today, and I'll let you take it away.
First of all, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. I wish I could be there personally with all of you, but I guess this is the next best thing. And it's particularly wonderful to be doing this today in the month of March, because it's Women's History Month, and yesterday was International Women's Day. So today I'm going to hopefully engage you in what I am incredibly passionate about, which is when it comes to health, sex really does matter. So women and men are different across almost every chronic disease we know. They're different in their presentation, their course, their prognosis, even their treatment response. But medicine has been built on models of men's health and studies of male animals. And this does a disservice to both men and women because women are not little men. So if you have a clinical trial and the drug is more effective in one sex than another, if you combine both sexes, you could be washing out the effect of a drug that could be really wonderful for half the population. The Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine wants to change that. Our mission is to enhance discoveries around sex differences in medicine, but even more importantly, leverage them, translate them into the development of what we are calling sex-dependent therapeutics. Therapies that incorporate the differences in our biology, in our physiology, to create more effective treatments for both men and women. And this is really critical in this day and age of precision medicine or personalized medicine, because what could be more personal than one's sex? So today I'm going to take you through a little journey and hopefully convince you of three things. One is that sex and gender are really important to science discovery in medicine. They're critical for clinical care. And frankly, it's good for business. They're critical for our economic health. So let's get started first at looking at just some examples, and these are only a few of some of the frequencies of different illnesses across the population. You'll just see percents in the population, and red is for women and blue is for men. And as you can see here, women have almost twice the risk of disorders like anxiety disorders and depression. Men have a slight advantage in cardiovascular disease, but heart disease is the #1 killer of women in the United States and in most middle-income countries. Women have almost higher rates of almost all of the autoimmune disorders: osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. And women have a much higher frequency of Alzheimer's disease. And we know it's not only because women live longer. So it's absolutely critical that we understand what are the causes of these differences and how can we develop more effective treatments that incorporate these differences. But first, let's go through just a couple of definitions. Now, sex and gender are related concepts, but they're not the same, and they both play a really critical role in medicine. Sex refers to the biology, our biologies. We have different sex chromosomes. Typically, XX represent female, XY typically represents male. We have sex hormones, gonadal hormones produced, estradiol produced by the ovaries, for example. In women, estradiol is the primary estrogen that works in the brain and the body. Testosterone produced from the testes in men. And then there are reproductive events that are specific to women: pregnancy, menopause. And our biologies actually have really important implications for the nature of these illnesses. But then there are also gender effects. Gender has to do with a social construct. It has to do with social roles and responsibilities. It has to do with help-seeking behavior. And just to give you an example of this is what we've been facing over the last year, which is sex differences in COVID response. Men are dying at a much higher rate from COVID than women. What is that about? Well, it's actually both a sex effect and a gender effect. It's a sex effect in that women have different immune systems than men. In fact, women have a bit more robust immune systems than men, and that even begins as early as fetal development. But also, men don't get themselves into treatment until it is really late. So they're coming into treatment late, unless the women in their lives have brought them into treatment. They're coming into treatment late, they're more severe, and so they're dying at a higher rate from COVID. So this is a great example of how both sex and gender really play a role in medicine and have significant implications for disease consequences, morbidity, and even mortality. Now, there are only 3 examples, believe it or not, only 3 primary examples that have actually incorporated the impact of sex, made huge differences in clinical care, and literally have changed US clinical guidelines. Unfortunately, there's 3, but I wanted to show you these to kind of give you a proof of principle that this can actually happen and needs to happen. Let's start with cardiovascular disease. Our models of cardiovascular disease, it used to be thought of just a man's disease, right? And so our models of cardiovascular disease had to do with these large vessels, plaque buildup in large vessels. Even our stress tests actually were built on models of large vessel disease. You have the plaque buildup in the vessel, it gets clogged, you get symptoms, there's the heart attack, right? But no, in women, cardiovascular disease is primarily a small vessel disease. And even the plaque buildup in small vessels looks different than plaque buildup in larger vessels. And so our stress tests are actually not picking up some of the risk for heart attack in women, and maybe one reason why women are dying at a higher rate from heart attacks than men, because they too may be getting in late and more severe once they get to treatment. Lung cancer. The primary form of death from cancer is actually lung cancer in women. Women have almost a 2-fold risk of lung cancer with the same level of smoke. And even 80% of lung cancer due to passive smoking is in women than in men. So this is a really different disease. It has many similarities, but it's a different disease even at the cellular level. So there was a genetic mutation that was discovered, and there were treatments targeted to that genetic mutation. They go to look at the treatment, doesn't look like it has any effect, till a brilliant scientist says, whoa, they're all male animals. Why don't we look at this in female animals? Sure enough, they look at it in female animals. It has an amazing effect on lung cancer, but only in females because it was targeted to the cell type that's primarily in females. This again changed the treatment of lung cancer, spawning a number of women's lung cancer programs, including the ones that were developed by Yolanda Colson, our own Yolanda Colson, who's the head of thoracic surgery here. And by the way, in terms of cardiovascular disease, I forgot to mention the Corrigan-Minahan Heart Program, because those differences in cardiovascular disease spawned heart health programs for women around the country, including one here run by Melissa Wood and Nandita Scott, with whom we are collaborating in ICON. And finally, there's stroke. Sex differences in brain damage occur after stroke. In fact, women have more ischemic damage after stroke than men. So treatment's starting to be developed. They develop a treatment. Lo and behold, looks like great treatment. We're going to move forward. Brilliant neurologist, female, I will say, in the early 2000s, looks and says, hey, they're all male animals. She looks at it in female animals. Lo and behold, here you see, wow, here's percent brain damage. Great treatment, right? Well, when she looked in female animals, it actually increased ischemic damage, increased brain damage in women. So this could have been a nightmare for the treatment of stroke. Again, changed the nature of stroke treatment in men and women. Okay, response to treatment then differs by sex. Drug effectiveness differs. In fact, in 2001, the General Accounting Office reported that 80% of adverse drug reactions were in women, 80%. Now, I want to say this is a really important fact because this is a quality control measure for hospitals, adverse drug reactions. So we need to do something about it. Why are we so surprised if most of the drugs have been developed on male animals? The only drug that has been FDA approved with sex-dependent doses is Ambien, the sleep drug Ambien. Why? Kennedy had a car accident. And what they found were high levels of Ambien in her system. The FDA went back, looked to see, gee, did we look at this by sex? Turns out they actually did look at it by sex, and women needed lower doses of Ambien. It changed the FDA because they went back and looked at the data by sex. So these drugs, why are they different? We absorb drugs differently. We distribute them differently across tissues in our body. We metabolize them differently. We eliminate them differently. The drugs themselves have different pharmacodynamics. So the nature of the drugs themselves work differently in men and women. And we need to do something about this. So what are we going to do? What is ICON going to do? Well, we are targeting the major chronic diseases of our time: major depression, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's disease. Now, heart disease and depression were the number 1 and 2 primary causes of disability worldwide, that is prior to COVID, but frankly, they will be after COVID as well. Women have twice the risk of depression. I already told you about heart disease, but the co-occurrence, the comorbidity of major depression and cardiovascular disease was slated to be the number 1 cause of disability worldwide last year and will be after COVID again. Women are twice the risk for that co-occurrence. People who have cardiovascular disease that have major depression have a 3 to 5-fold risk of death from cardiovascular disease. So this is more severely and disproportionately affecting women, and we need to do something about it. That's not all. Depression, cardiovascular disease are independent risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And we know that women have a much higher frequency of Alzheimer's disease. We also know now it's not only because women live longer. We have no effective treatments for this co-occurrence. Research and healthcare largely ignore the sex differences and typically pursue these diseases within their medical silos. So our mission is to leverage knowledge about sex differences in the shared causes of these disorders of the brain and the heart and develop sex-dependent therapeutics. These diseases are also crippling our economy. In 2010, depression cost over $200 billion. That is a low estimate because that was in 2010. This is the second cause of disability worldwide, and we don't have a new measure of economic impact. The impact of depression on the loss to work productivity because of absenteeism is tremendous, let alone the treatment of depression. Cardiovascular disease, almost $900 billion, and it's estimated to be over $1 trillion by 2030. And Alzheimer's disease is almost at $1 trillion now, and left untreated will be about $2 trillion by 2030. The costs are highest for comorbidities, the co-occurrence of these diseases. In fact, over 90% of Medicare spending is due to comorbidity. So this has a substantial impact on our economy. And given, of course, that almost 18% of GDP goes into healthcare. So this is a major impact on our economy. So we are ignoring the biology of sex. We are treating these illnesses within silos, and together they're going to tank our economy. So how is ICON going to tackle this? Well, the discovery of sex differences necessitates a lifespan perspective. What do I mean by that? Well, there are windows of opportunity when the brain and the body are either differentially flooded with gonadal hormones in fetal development, in puberty, in women in pregnancy, and or depleted of gonadal hormones in women in perimenopause and menopause. And these naturalistic windows are when sex differences emerge, when the causes of these sex differences can actually be seen and we can study, and we can also target for early intervention. In our quest to uncover sex differences in depression, we discovered shared causes with the immune system and our hormonal system that differed for men and women, and that whose origins were early in development, in fetal development, prior to these causes manifesting into depression, cardiovascular disease, and ultimately Alzheimer's disease. This suggested to us a reconceptualization of these illnesses as crossing organs and tissues, having shared causes, differing by men and women, that we could target early prior to the manifestation of disease. What if we could look back to prevent an adverse future? What do I mean by that? For example, sex differences in depression emerge just post-puberty. Sex differences in cardiovascular disease, men in their 40s, women 5 to 10 years later, and sex differences in Alzheimer's disease much later in life. But if we could target the brain and the heart just post-puberty, we could be preventing Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease down the road. And in many cases, depression is a developmental disorder. So we could be targeting these illnesses just post-pregnancy. This is not pie in the sky. This is actually what ICON has been planning to do, and I have some really cool projects I'm going to tell you about in a minute. But first, we have a long-term vision. We want to reduce the co-occurrence of brain and heart disease. We want to develop sex-dependent therapeutics and focus this on clinical care. We want to devise unique strategies to maintain healthy aging. What does that mean? We are thinking of disease as looking at how to maintain health, how to maintain resilience in the face of risk. That is what a lifespan perspective allows for. You can target things early prior to the manifestation of disease. And we want to develop global strategies because these co-occurrences are a global phenomenon, global issue. And we want to particularly focus on morbidity and mortality in developing countries. And we're doing that with some of our partners at the School of Public Health. What are our strategic priorities? I talked about enhancing discovery. We want to develop shared resources. Why? We want to leave things for the next generation to capitalize on this and continue to develop novel therapeutics. That's right. We want to develop and accelerate the development of sex-dependent therapeutics. And we want to educate, advocate, and prevent. We want to educate not only the next generation, but our colleagues who need to be incorporating the impact of sex and gender as well. We want to engage the public. You are really important in this fight, right? You are important because you can ask your physicians about these things. And also we want to advocate in Congress, which we are doing by partnering with Women Against Alzheimer's, who's in DC and has a lot of expertise in advocacy in Congress. And ultimately, of course, we want to prevent these illnesses by taking this lifespan perspective. So we have a long-term vision, but what are we doing on the road to make it happen? We're developing tools to enhance diagnostic prediction and prevention. We're developing this clinical tool for identifying Alzheimer's disease risk in early midlife between the ages of 45 to 65, kind of akin to a Framingham risk score for cardiovascular disease. We're using big data. Some of you may have heard this term, big data, thousands of cases of genotyping connected with your medical records or connected with characteristics and phenotyping, clinical phenotyping. And they're going to be using this to enhance precision medicine. We need to be doing this by sex. And so we are identifying sex differences in genes that are shared across disorders of the brain, as well as their connections with disorders of the heart. We're creating tools to test drug effectiveness by sex. One of our colleagues is calling their development of a tool an organ on a chip. He's taking nerve cells, brain cells, and looking at how they communicate with immune cells by taking a slice of the gut. Yes, there are brain cells that sit in the gut. How cool is that? And using that tissue to screen drugs for drug development by sex. And we're working with our colleagues in the stem cell, human stem cell, a bank here at Mass General to model depression and Alzheimer's disease to develop sex-dependent diagnostic tools and therapeutics. And finally, we've been developing products and strategies for new therapeutics. As I said, preventing depression, hypertension, and Alzheimer's disease by intervening post-pregnancy. Well, we're developing use of digital health devices deployed post-high-risk pregnancies to monitor and intervene for hypertension and mood and anxiety. We have partners that we've engaged across the hospital. Psychiatry department, of course, OBGYN, cardiology with the Women's Heart Health Program, neurology. As I said, we're partnering with the School of Public Health around women's global health. And we're also partnering with Women Against Alzheimer's as our advocacy partner in Congress. So we are at an inflection point now. This is a really important time in history. In 2015, the director of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, he required people working in animals to include female animals in studies. And he required scientists working on cells to include female cells, unless they had a really good rationale for not doing this. That was a game changer. The NIH is the primary funding source for science, not only in this country, but worldwide. So that's a game changer. He really changed the game by requiring that. And even editors of some high impact journals like Lancet have come out to say that people need to describe their distributions by sex and gender and talk about analyses by sex. And finally, as we know, COVID has been a clarion call. Sex and gender are critical for understanding morbidity and mortality. And secondly, the issue of comorbidity. How is it that cardiovascular disease and diabetes somehow impacts an infectious disease of respiratory of the lungs? That is true because there are shared causes like our immune system that cross the heart and the lung. So this is a critical time in our history, and we need to heed the call. There are academic centers around the country that are embracing this concept, but Mass General, with its amazing resources and an innovative think tank mentality, we are well positioned to lead the way in this, but we have not as yet. ICON wants to change that. We have a unique approach for tackling these issues, and we've already engaged many investigators and clinicians across the hospital. So yes, we are at an inflection point, and leadership institutions like Mass General need to show the way for enduring systemic change in our country's healthcare system and healthcare systems abroad. Thank you for joining me today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jill, for that really remarkable talk. And you highlighted so many important points that I'm not sure that people realize on a daily basis. Maybe if you can stop sharing your slides so we can see everyone. And I would invite you all to please turn on your cameras if you're willing and able and ask questions of Jill. You can either raise your hand or just unmute and ask, and I'll call on you. We do have a question, or enter your questions in the chat. So we're going to jump right in, Jill, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
We do have one question in the chat so far, and I would, as I said, encourage you to enter more. There's certainly a lot of things to think about. The question that we have is, do we know if sex differences, and this is a very timely question if you read the New York Times, because the question is, do we know if sex differences were considered when the effectiveness or associated side effects of the COVID vaccines were studied? So there was an article in the New York Times yesterday, I believe, on the differences in sex in the response to COVID vaccines. So Jill, would you like to talk a little bit more about COVID and sex differences?
Sure. Great question. Well, I guess the short answer first is no, in part because, of course, we're using emergency authorization use now, so they really needed to show efficacy before, obviously, and safety before giving it to so many people. But it's a really important question. There are men and women, obviously, that were vaccinated. This needs to be looked at because, frankly, as I said to you before, women actually have a more robust response to vaccines, and it's unclear whether that's true for only premenopausal women or postmenopausal women. So this is something that has been in the news a lot, the sex differences, but actually the development of the vaccine, this has not reached that level at this point.
Right. They said, Jill, in that article, as I'm sure you saw, that more women are reporting side effects, which fits exactly with what you said about women having because the side effects are a response to, your body's immune response. And so the side effects are an immune response. And as Jill said, women have a more robust immune reaction. And so these studies are now being done in retrospect, in hindsight, basically looking at everyone who's received the vaccine.
Yeah, and the other thing, which is a great question, is, and I'll need to look into this, is how did they develop the vaccine in the first place?
Right.
Was it mostly initially in male animals? So
yes, it wouldn't surprise any of us, I'm sure, if that were to be the case. Jill, maybe you can talk a little bit about, we have another question about stress and how stress affects women and men differently, and how it relates to diseases that you're studying, like depression, heart disease, and Alzheimer's disease, because clearly the last year has been remarkably stressful in so many ways. And certainly this is having an effect on health across the board, but particularly on women. So maybe you could talk a little bit about stress.
Yeah. My favorite topic, well, not my favorite topic, but actually the study of stress actually got me into this whole idea with the Innovation Center and the comorbidity issue. Stress affects every chronic disease we know. And the circuitry in the brain that regulates stress actually regulates mood. It regulates the heart. It's involved with all our hormonal systems, our stress hormones, our gonadal hormones, and it's actually also involved in our immune system. And to be honest, it's also connected to our gut. So the way that we react under stress actually affects all our other organs and tissues. And finally, the brain regions that regulate stress are some of the most highly sexually dimorphic in the brain. And so the development of this circuitry and how that is deviated even in development can set the stage for the onset of depression, since the stress circuitry actually regulates mood and anxiety, cardiovascular disease, because it regulates the heart, and it does through electrically between direct connection between the brain and the heart through the vagus nerve, but it also does so physiologically, so it can affect the heart. And also it can go down and affect the gut. When you're under stress, you don't eat. When you're under stress, if you're menstruating, your cycle stops. So it can have major implications for all sorts of bodies and tissues, but it does so differently in men and women because the regulation of this by these brain regions actually differs by sex. These regions develop differently in the male and female brain, and they function differently across our lifespan. In an earlier study, we showed that actually the regulation of stress and our physiology changed across the menstrual cycle. And what we showed is that the regulation of these hormones, of these gonadal hormones, actually allowed for a change in physiology that showed that hormones in the brain actually were dependent on how these brain regions were activated or not. So there are many ways in which we react differently in the brain, and our bodies react differently. But we can react differently to get to the same physiologic level as well. So sex differences in these systems does not mean sex differences in behavior. Sometimes our brain actually acts differently to get to the same level of stress so that we can regulate that. But what it shows is that we need to understand these differences in order to tackle them from a disorder point of view when they go awry.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jill. If anyone has other questions, please go ahead and raise your hand or put them in the chat. We have another question about how your research impacts the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness in children and adolescents. And the person asking the question is particularly thinking about developing brains and, for example, Adderall and Ritalin prescriptions. Has this been looked at in adolescents at all, the differences in sex? I mean, we know, teenage years are when, children are going through puberty.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, this is the advantage of the lifespan perspective. The brain and the body are differentially developed in male and female fetuses. The brain develops differently, and that is in part has direct effects of sex chromosomes, but also the effect of gonadal hormones. And gonadal hormones can set the stage for what we call the sexual differentiation of the brain. And in healthy development, there are lots of variations on the themes, but some things can get set in development that set the stage for kind of lifelong implications and risks. Puberty is another really important period. So life doesn't end, obviously, mostly life doesn't end after birth. And so there's life in general. And puberty is another explosive period that changes the brain and the body. And actually, our brains don't even fully develop until we're in our early 20s, actually 2 years earlier in the female brain than the male brain. So there are areas of the brain that don't completely get connected to the rest of the body, those that are inhibitory control regions, until our kids are in their early 20s. So these periods, these periods of adolescence and the periods of childhood can have major lifelong implications for the rest of that child's life. And so what we do during those periods and how we ameliorate potential early risks, there's lots of ways to do that. The brain is incredibly plastic. And so we have lots of opportunities to change things in childhood and adulthood. As far as medications are concerned, there's pros and cons, right? There are kids that need these medications because their brains have gone awry, and they can create homeostasis. On the other hand, they can be misused. And so very important to find a balance between those two. Did I answer that question?
Yes, I think so. Thank you. And I think that there's many people on the call who have likely raised sons and daughters who understand a lot about what you're talking about. We have another fascinating question that I really want to get to that talks about, this is so important in research, Jill, and that is, something just popped up over my chat. Here we go. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of actually designing a study to look at sex differences rather than just simply controlling for sex when you analyze data? Fascinating question, don't you think? Because it's very different. and an intellectual question from one of our attendees. And I have to say, being a scientist myself, there's huge implications for this because of the cost of doing research, for example, designing a study to actually look at sex differences. So Jill, maybe you can enlighten us a little about this because it's a very important consideration.
Well, I don't know who asked that question, but it was a brilliant question because it's something that I sort of am on my soapbox about a lot. People always say to me, well, we controlled for sex, or we controlled for gender. And it's a nuisance variable. They call it a nuisance variable. Okay, so that just sort of gets my blood boiling. It's very difficult once you've designed something, collected the data, that you haven't thought of it initially by designing it to deal with the sex differences that are important. I'll give you an example. If menstrual cycle and hormones have an effect on a study you're doing on brain or a study on mood, a clinical study on mood, and you have women that are all over the menstrual cycle, but we know that some of those hormones actually affect brain regions differently, which then affect mood, which then affect your behavioral measures. That if you haven't controlled for that or designed your study initially so that all the women are actually at the same point in the menstrual cycle, you could have results that actually wash each other out, or you can have spurious findings. That's just one example of the many in which if you don't design your study, you can't control away the effects because they're significant.
Yes.
I hope that's, I don't want to get too much in the technical.
No.
Right number of men and women. Otherwise, you got 3 men, you got 10 women, you control for it, but there's no way that you would ever have found an effect with 3 men and 10 women.
Exactly. I think it's I just think it's important that that question was asked because it reminds all of us as we are consumers of science to remember this difference, right? Was a study actually designed to look at sex differences, or did they just control for it at the end or try to control for it in some way?
Yes.
So Jill, I know.
I'll just add one thing on that, Sue. At least they'll have thought of it. So that's a good thing.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And as you mentioned, Francis Collins has definitely changed the way we do science, at least science that's NIH funded, and made us all think of it. But are we thinking about it in the right way? I'm not sure. And that's why we need ICON at Mass General to help all of our investigators who are planning experiments to really consider this effect. So we're amazingly lucky to have you and your team and ICON as a resource for all of us as we do our research.
I'll just say one thing in response to that, because I love that as being at under the rubric of the Research Institute, ICON also wants to be a resource for the entire hospital. And part of our mission is actually to train people in the hospital, clinicians, scientists who are interested in really studying these things, thinking about these things at every level of analysis, or healthcare service issues that they come to us and we can help them to do that.
Yeah, it'll be really great for the future. So Jill, thank you so much for this remarkable talk and this discussion. You presented a remarkably ambitious vision for all of us today. Your research agenda holds great impact on the future of clinical approaches in some areas that impact so many of us and our families. So you clearly have a strategy and you know where you want to go. So tell us a little bit about, in closing, what you need to realize this vision. What does the future of ICON look like, and how can we all help you get there?
Well, I've spent the last few years, we at ICON have spent the last few years raising a substantial amount of grant funding. And we were honored last year to be deemed an NIH Specialized Center for Research Excellence on Sex Differences. And we're awarded a substantial grant from the Office for Research on Women's Health. So we're very proud of that. That's our MGH score now that we're hoping to remain in perpetuity. So we've spent a lot of time doing that, but we have lots of innovative projects like the ones I've just told you about. We have early investigators that have wonderful ideas that need launching. And I would love to launch a challenge, an innovative challenge to all of these MGH fantastic think tankers and innovators to develop new therapeutics that are sex dependent. And in order to do that, we need philanthropic support. My chair in women's health, I'm incredibly grateful to the Morshner family for endowing this chair in women's health and really doing it under the rubric of the Research Institute. Why is that? Because there are no other chairs in women's health around the country that are sitting in an institute that crosses every department and division. They're within a silo, within departments. And so this actually says it represents something for the hospital. It represents a commitment and an investment by MGH that they want to incorporate the impact of sex into what we are doing both in science and in healthcare. And so we want to be able to sustain the vision of ICON. We want the vision, just as the chair, to last longer than its current incumbent. So having an investment in the vision to endow that vision is something that we would love to do, but we have many other ways that people can become engaged. There are the projects I just told you about, but there are also smaller investments that can be made. The point is that we want to create an enduring systemic change, not only within Mass General, but to have Mass General be a leader in this arena for the country and also abroad.
Sue, can I just make a comment?
Please, Maurizio.
We were very fortunate to recruit Jill to Mass General, and we're so fortunate to have her with ICON, with all the things. Jill is one of the best funded NIH, from NIH investigators in MGH. But you can tell that she has so many ideas for collaborations, particularly kind of the high risk, high reward projects that you can only fund with philanthropy. And so I think that I'm hoping that, people realize how important it is to look with the lens that separates, men from women. And the COVID-19, for example, is a demonstration of sex differences and I think that so I'm hoping that ICON will attract philanthropic support, as in my mind clearly deserves it.
Thank you so much, Maurizio. And that's Dr. Maurizio Fava, who is the chief of our Department of Psychiatry and also the director of the Division of Clinical Research at Mass General. So thank you, Maurizio, for both joining us and for having the vision to bring Jill here and to establish ICON. Jill, you've really inspired us all today. I'm sure you set a bold vision for ICON. And it's one that I'm sure we can achieve, particularly at a place like Mass General and within the Mass General Research Institute. I'm excited about your work and thinking about how this will impact even my own research and how it'll impact the next generation as people begin, all of our investigators and scientists and clinicians begin to think about, some for the first time maybe, about how important sex differences are when we think about transforming medicine going forward. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. In a couple days, you will receive a follow-up email that will include a recording of this event. And so we really encourage you to share it far and wide with your networks. People who are interested in this subject, please share the recording of this event. And if you still have questions after today, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Dr. Goldstein or to Deborah Farr in our development office. Their contact information will be in the email that you receive. So you'll have a direct line, a VIP line directly to Dr. Goldstein going forward to get all of your questions answered. So again, thank you all for joining us today. I think it was really a remarkable talk, Jill. Again, thank you. And
Thank you for coming, everyone.
yes, and I hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Until
Bye.
next time.